This is Brent, Allan Winters, CommonLawyer.com, and this is part 13 of a series wherein and whereby we attempt to discover, provision by provision, blow by blow, whether or not the Constitution of the United States is consistent with the Bible, and if not, what is the reason for that apparent inconsistency. We've been discussing Article 1, Section 2, Clauses 6, and Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1, and those two clauses establish by constitutional authority the two houses of our Congress, and by so doing, we had said, the intention is to split the legislative power into two branches that will check one the other and bar, as it were, our legislature at the federal level from running amok. At least that's the idea. Now, if that doesn't work, and sometimes it doesn't, as we have seen many times in the past, there is also the executive branch who has often, and in every administration almost, refused to enforce legislation that Congress has passed. I'll make an observation from experience with government that struck me at the time I saw it, and it made me understand how evil operates. Traditionally, within my lifetime anyway, which has spanned now nearly 60 years, our present two-party system, as the courts have called it, has consisted of two parties, the one named Democrats and the other one Republicans. The former, called Democrats, are known as the party, falsely known, I should say, as the party of individual rights. But what that party claims to give with one hand, it systematically takes away with the other. The other party, called Republicans, also claims to enforce individual rights, while at the same time flattening those rights in favor of getting who they call the bad guy, the criminal, and by so doing removes rights for also those that they believe or say that are non-criminals. So it can be said that Democrats, by and large, are a party of people that do not understand economics, because when they give what they claim to give with one hand, they take it away through property right transfers and plunder of one group of another to another hand. Whereas the Republicans, by and large, can be characterized as a group of people who have yet to be personally abused by government, that is, by a cop busting down their door, arresting them, and while they continue their fantasy that they're immune from such things. But what they don't know is that the evil empire eats its own, and it won't hesitate once it gets out of hand with the power that the Republicans have given it, and it won't hesitate to eat them too. So in sum, Democrats are a group of people that do not understand economics or refuse to for whatever reason, and Republicans are a group of people that have yet to feel the raw force of government come against them unlawfully in violation of their dignity and their rights. Now, related to that particular false point of view by each party, the Democrats believe that legislation, by and large, that legislation is the answer to our problems. And so statutory law, Congress doing this, doing that, making a show, as it happened during the administration of Bill Clinton, passing massive legislation claiming to put 100,000 cops on the streets, passing truckloads of regulations to control the resources on federal land, keep the American people from enjoying those resources, even to the point of not being able to walk in the woods, but doing it all just to make a show that makes people feel good, their particular constituency anyway, as though government has acted to do something about the problems of crime and environmental exploitation, but then never spending the money to enforce this legislation. And then Congress and the presidency, once they get into the hands of the other party, the Republicans, who tout themselves as the party of law enforcement, that party enforces all of this legislation and regulation of the Democrat Party with an absolute vengeance, stifling production and jailing people by the hundreds for violation of these so-called laws. I suppose this just goes to show what people have known for a long, long time, that the question isn't, can government do this particular thing or that particular thing right? The question that should be asked is, can government do anything right? Let's put it in a different way. Can government do anything well? And the answer is no. Government cannot do anything better than some other non-government entity or person could do it given the right incentive. Of course, there are some things that only government can do, even though they won't do it well, but it wouldn't work any other way, and those two things, in this case of our Constitution, are national defense and justice. In other words, providing courts. Justice doesn't mean criminal law. Justice at common law, in a common law government, in a common law country, means providing courts so that men may settle their differences between and among one another, including the differences between men and government. And we'll address one more distraction of the evil empire and its lackeys, and that distraction is this. It is constantly said, and has been for decades, that if a corporation can do so well a certain thing, why isn't it government can't do that? Why isn't it, it is said, why isn't it that government can't be run like a business? Well, friends, neighbors, and kin, such a question is utterly childish. Why? Because government isn't a business. Government is government. It does not operate for profit, and if it does, it gets even worse than it was. It cannot be expected that government will not waste money for that reason. Anybody that's been in the military service can see and understand and know what government waste is all about, especially during times of war. No expense is spared, or that's the way it used to be, and any waste that occurs is to be expected. That is the nature of government, because government does not operate for profit. Until a person or a combination of persons understands that they will suffer the financial deprivations of waste won't stop. As anyone knows who's tried to raise children and tried to teach them not to leave the refrigerator door standing open so the electric bill won't be higher, or turn the lights out. Well, there are well-known government people who have made hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, charging anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 for an hour speech, wherein such people complain that government ought to be ran like a business, and their arguments seem, just to listen to them on their face, persuasive. And they cite examples. For example, why is it that UPS can at any given moment tell you exactly where your package is in the process that you tried to ship to somebody else, while they're handling at any given moment literally millions of packages? And the U.S. Postal Service can't even tell you whether or not half the time your package has been delivered. Well, of course, we're impressed and encouraged by what UPS or FedEx or any of the other of these private carriers can do. But to expect government to do that is silliness, because the profit motive is not there. Those folks don't even have fear of being fired for not doing a good job. And it is for that reason that a monopoly on letter carrying or any other packages or letters being carried should never have been given to the United States Postal Service. It is a corporation. They've done a terrible job. It is unconstitutional to give a monopoly to a government bureaucracy such as they, and the proof of that is they are now failing in comparison to UPS and FedEx, who carry only packages and by law are prevented from carrying letters in favor of the monopoly of the Postal Service. And monopolies, remember, can only exist at the point of a sword in ancient times, and now at the point of a gun, a whip, or jail. Try carrying private letters for profit and see what the federal government does to you. Monopolies, of course, are against the Bible also, and the common law and the Bible are consistent at that point. We see no example in the law of God, the standard of Scripture, anywhere, in any of its genre, whether it be history, case law, statutes, ordinances, example, poetry, proverbs, the epistles of the Newer Testament, anywhere do we see example or a command or an inclination that government force should be used to prevent people from establishing by contract relationships and making money. Well, in these two clauses of our Constitution in Article 1, establishing the separate houses of the United States Congress, sometimes the writers have called these bicameral. Camera, an old Latin term meaning two boxes or two houses. We ought to mention here that the method, the process whereby those representatives are chosen is set forth in our Constitution, and that process is to be by the states deciding how to run their elections. And we talked about the word election meaning fundamentally to choose, and how that our Bibles don't define always in cases where we see representatives or where we see, for example, in Acts chapter 1, an apostle chosen, doesn't always define exactly the process except that they are to be chosen. In Acts chapter 1, which can be taken as an example to consider for sure, although nothing is commanded there, two candidates were chosen by the 120 that were present. Obviously, somebody must have thought that constituted a quorum, and they chose two candidates to fill the position of Judas as one of the 12 witnesses of the life of Jesus Christ, and by the way of his death, burial, and resurrection, and ascension into heaven. So the entire congregation of the household of God there at that time made that choice, and very likely, although the text doesn't say, they chose individually. Everyone appeared to have participated, because it says they selected the two candidates that were qualified. That means they were eyewitnesses, and they heard with their own ears what Jesus said and saw what he did during that time. They had, as it were, sensory perception of the facts in question. And then it says that they drew lots to decide which one of the two qualified candidates would be chosen to fill that position. Now, lots in the Bible, spoken of on more than one occasion, would be akin to our game of chance. When I was 4.5 years old, my brother was about 5.5, and even long before that, we pestered my father to go to the field with him. We wanted, in the worst way, to drive a tractor. That certainly was the next thing to look forward to in our world, and I can't tell you how excited I was. One morning I woke up. No, I didn't wake up. Dad woke me up. I was upstairs, and my brother there was with me, and he hollered up the stairway and said, "Boys, get out of bed. We're going to the field." Well, we knew what that meant. That meant that we might get a shot at driving a tractor. We were up and downstairs hardly dressed. Breakfast didn't mean anything to us at that point, although Mom fed us, as she was always careful to do, and he took us, and to the hayfield we went. We got there, and the boys that Dad had gotten on the phone and called began to trickle in, most of them teenagers. My granddad was there, and we had an old WD-45 tractor that he had bought to try to wean him off horses in the oil field. It was a 1946 Alice Chalmers, and the advantage of that tractor to us little boys was that we couldn't reach the foot clutch to throw the wheels out of engagement and stop the machine. It had a hand clutch on it, and once it was in gear, all a fella had to do was reach up beside the steering wheel and pull the hand clutch. A hay wagon was attached to the drawbar, and Dad put her down in grandma, that's first gear, and our job was to slowly guide the thing as it moved across the field at ever so slow pace, and the boys would pick up the bales of hay and throw them up on the wagon as it slowly went by, and one of the men on the wagon would stack the hay. All we had to do was keep from running over a bale, which was quite a feat for us at that age. It took all we could do just to turn the big steering wheel. Didn't have power steering, and if it was a row crop tractor, that means it had a narrow front end, and if the front wheels happened to hit a corn cob or a clod or a crawdad castle, it would spin the wheel very rapidly, so we had instructions not to put our hands through the spokes of the wheel, keep them on the outside. And it was so hard to turn the tractor when we got to the end of the field, Dad or Granddad or Steve Klein or Harold, Funk, Cousin, one of the boys would jump up on the tractor, turn the machine and the rig around for us, and head us back down through the field. Well, we got to the field, and then the next question was, who gets to drive first? So Dad pulled a couple of pieces of straw out of a hay bale. They were hay, not straw, but there was straw in it. Not regular wheat straw, but in other words, just straw from the stems of the clover hay and the Timothy hay that was mixed in with it. And he broke them off so that they were different lengths, and he held them in his hand with his fingers closed around them so we wouldn't be able to see which one was longest, and he had us two boys, draw straws, and the longer straw straw would mean that that boy who drew that longer straw would drive first. And I disremember which one of us drew the longer straw. But what I do remember was it seemed like, even at that time as a little boy, a fair way to make that judgment decision of choosing. Actually, it wasn't a judgment. The only judgment was which process should be used to make the choice fair. And so at this point, I'll remind my listener again the difference between our common law tradition at its most fundamental level and the civil law tradition, between the law of the land and the law of the city. The law of the land is an ancient phrase that means due process. And to us, it is more important, the process is more important than the result, because even the Bible in Matthew chapter 18 says, if you will but follow the process that God has set forth here, Jesus said this, then the result is guaranteed to be good. God honors it. But if you do not follow that process, God guarantees nothing. Well, Dad chose a process, and he left the result to chance. Now I want to remind you one other thing here. Chance is another word for human ignorance. There is no chance in the mind of God. When you flip a coin and you say, well, what's the chances it'll land heads or tails? Well, for all practical purposes, there's a 50% chance it'll land heads, and there's a 50% chance it'll land tails. But that's in your eyes. In God's eyes, He knows perfectly all the laws of physics. He knows perfectly the atmospheric pressure wherever you flip that coin. He knows perfectly at that point the dew point, the amount of moisture in the air. He knows perfectly any bias, because no man can make anything that's perfect as God can. He knows everything. He even knows when you flip the coin with your thumb, the vector, the torque, the amount of flip you give it. He knows how many times it's going to spin in the air, given all of those facts that we mentioned before, that no man could know. He knows how it's going to land, and it isn't because, actually, to even go further, because He looked ahead and figured it out. Because if you say God looked ahead and figured it out, you're saying that at some point in time He was ignorant of some fact. God has never been ignorant of any fact. God cannot be taught in that sense. God is all-knowing. The fancy word is omniscient. Omni means all, and science means knowledge. He is all-knowing, and always has been, and always will be, and there was never a time He did not know all things that can be known. So chance is not part of God's mind. It is only man's word for his ignorance compared to God. So in drawing those lots, that was chance from my perspective, and from Dad's perspective, and from my brother Dave's perspective, but it was not chance in the eyes of the all-knowing God. So the process in that respect seemed fair, and we see in the Bible that lots are sometimes used, and they're justified. For example, Proverbs says it this way, the lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof, that is the result, is of the Lord. So we emphasize the process, not the result. The law of the city, in contrast to our common law of the land, emphasizes the result, not the process. The process doesn't matter. We must, says the law of the city, reach the result that the code, that men say, that the ruler says, the will of the ruler. We must reach that result. Oh, freedom is in our common law, and our common law is nature's expression of the law written, the very words of God. And the two are wholly compatible, wholly consistent, and wholly consonant. And just because men in positions of power do not follow those laws of God as written in His holy writ, His command, and as He points out in nature and has established and will not change without His suspension, and that doesn't happen very often. Well, under God's system of law, men are free. Under man's system of the city, men are not free. And when I say the city, I mean city law, civil law. Now, as to taxation spoken of in these verses, we talked about how representatives are chosen. And the Bible doesn't specify, it doesn't say majority vote cannot be chosen to choose representatives. I would observe in passing that God is sovereign over that method also. Now, some have said that taxation, such as the Constitution authorizes, is wrong, and that many men don't like taxes. Probably the majority of people don't want to pay them, although I found that not to be really true. I used to think it. It's not true. A lot of people want to pay taxes, and the reason they want to pay taxes is because they believe it is their duty to support the madness that goes on. I have a hard time understanding that. And the other reason people want to support the tax laws is because they say, if I'm going to be forced to pay, I want others to be forced to pay also. That kind of thinking is godless, by the way, but nonetheless, that's the way it often works. But some have said that to think that taxes are wrong because you don't want to pay taxes is the wrong reason. There must be a lawful reason. Well, I object to that a little bit. Some people don't want to pay taxes because if they pay the taxes that the government claims that they owe, they won't feed their families. They won't have any money. If you're struggling, as most people are, you'd want to use that money to buy more shoes for your children or a nicer place to live so you could have a little cleaner environment, a little more room, and by the way, a little more room provides opportunity for cleanliness sometimes, or to take your children places, need money for that, and teach them things so they can see and learn about how other people live. If a person has to pay that money to the government, he can't fulfill his responsibilities toward God. One time in 1 year, I was younger, and my family was younger, and we were trying to start a business, and we made right at $10,000 that year, and I think we had 4 or 5 children at that time, and needless to say, that's not enough to support the family. Now we had a big garden. We were able to milk goats at that time. We did have some other ways to make money, but I remember discovering and feeling the force at that time of having to pay what's called the self-employment tax, which if you're self-employed, purportedly the government says you have to pay it no matter what, no matter how much money you make. If you make $5,000, you pay a flat rate of about 15%. If you make $50,000 or $500,000, it's still 15%. Well, if you only make $10,000, I think it was between 9 and 10 I made that year. That cuts a big chunk out of what I could spend to feed my children. And then I began to realize how wrong it is to attempt to befuddle men and women into paying what's called the self-employment tax, which some people call the Social Security tax. And it cannot be rightly said that it's a Social Security tax because the money goes to the government and it's spent on everything else. There is no Social Security trust fund. Take it from me, that much I figured out. And have studied research on the subject. It doesn't exist. So it's nothing but a way to weasel money out of unsuspecting people who want to be sincere and pay their taxes. It's done under false pretenses. That's the crime at common law. And the whole idea should be scuttled. So I sum up this point by saying that if people don't want to pay taxes so they can feed their children, that's a good reason. Because it is incumbent upon parents to feed their children. It is a responsibility, not only found in Holy Writ in the Bible, but it is a law of nature that parents feed their young and not give their money to a bureaucracy to be fed or paid to those who control the Federal Reserve Bank. And according to the Grace Commission that was commissioned not too long ago to find out where our tax dollars wind up. That was during the Reagan administration appointed by President Reagan. Their official report concluded that not 1 penny of income tax dollars goes to pay for any services to Americans, but every dime of federal income tax goes to pay usurious interest. And by the way, any interest is usury, forbidden in Scripture and at common law. It goes to pay the interest to the Federal Reserve Bank on a national debt so called. And I would add also that that is a ruse, because the money is created out of thin air. It isn't money at all. It's just an idea that they want to charge interest on, and do so. Now we come to Article 1, Section 3, Clause 3, which says as follows. No person shall be a senator, that's a United States senator, who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years, and been 9 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. Now, this clause tells us that in order to become a member of the United States Senate, the candidate must be 30 years old. Is that biblical? Well, I suppose there's some precedent for it in the Bible. Seems that priests in the Bible under the Levitical priesthood, which is foreshadow of the Melchizedek priesthood, it's not the real priesthood, but God set a precedent. He said in order to exercise this office as a priest, you need to be 30 years old. It says here also that he shall have been a citizen of the United States for 9 years. Why 9 years? If anybody knows the answer to that question, they can let me know. 9 years is quite a while. I haven't found exactly why it is 9 years, but it is quite a while, I'll say that, and maybe it was a compromise that was made, but the idea is that if you have been a citizen of the United States, your loyalty will be to the United States. You will have become acclimated to some degree to our common law government. And that was the great concern of those that put together the Constitution, that we would not allow into our United States immigrants that did not have a basis for understanding our common law government. It had taken centuries to hammer this thing out and make it secure. It became, we called it the Constitution of England, which was our Constitution, and then we put it in writing. It's a way of life and thinking, and it comes as an inheritance through generations. And I'd pointed out before that other countries have taken our Constitution, sometimes almost word for word or provisions from it, and it has never done them any good because they didn't have the mindset built into their souls by inheritance that would allow them to take advantage of its precepts. Now, I'm a student of history to whatever degree I can be and have been for many decades. I like to read history. I like to learn. It helps me understand where we've been and where we're going. And I like to read the history of Europe. The history of Europe is bound up in the history of Christianity, and even more so, the history of the island we call Britain. And it is utterly impossible to understand the history of Europe, or more particularly of Britain, from which our culture and law and government and all other things has arisen, without understanding the history of Christianity, for example, on the island of Britain. Well, I bring that point up because our Constitution and our federal government, from the time of the Constitution's ratification until 1965, that is almost 200 years, just short of 200 years by a few short years, about 18, all that time, almost 200 years, it was the declared policy of the United States government by statute and regulation that people immigrating from Europe had precedent over people immigrating from other parts of the world. Well, that all changed in 1965. But the reason that favor was given to Europeans was because it was believed, and rightly so to a great degree, that those people would have an understanding, just through their very family lives, to our common law way of freedom, which, by the way, is the only way to freedom. But more so than any other place, Britain, because Britain was a common law country. And is it any wonder now that we are losing what we had? Oh, we always wanted people to immigrate here, but we knew that reality demanded that people immigrate here who could be assimilated into our understanding quickly. Well, we expected, and nobody thought anything else when our Constitution was ratified, that people of British descent, if not that European descent, would come here, and we would give them 9 years to acclimate themselves to be here before they would be allowed to be senators from their particular state. Now, United States senators are required to be a little older than those that are elected to the House of Representatives, and the reason for that is because those that ratified the Constitution were of the mind that 5 years of age older would make a U.S. senator a little more contemplative and of slower moving mind. And certainly that is true to a great degree. Young men, by nature, are more attuned to their souls and more impetuous in their actions that way. Oh, I shouldn't say they're attuned to their souls. Older men get more attuned also. They just learn to be wise and move with caution. This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and the next time we'll start with part 14 of our discussion concerning whether or not our Constitution of the United States comports with the Bible, blow by blow, and the next next provision we'll consider, Lord willing, is Article 1, Section 3, Clause 4, which concerns the Vice President of the United States. Until then, I hope you're able to consider what we've said, maybe even put some of it to practice and come to a conclusion yourself as to whether or not our Constitution is biblical.